Ads schmads. If you don't want ads, that's okay. Choose the Dave McWilliams Plus option on Apple Podcasts. And hey presto, no ads.
To understand the economy, you have to understand human nature.
This podcast is powered by Acast.
How are you doing there? We are back in the HQ, John and I. We are just back from a short but intensive tour of Ireland. We were in Dublin last Monday, Limerick Wednesday, Galway Thursday. Those of you who came out to see us, thank you so much. Those of you who didn't, you missed the gig of a lifetime.
If we may say so ourselves.
Anyway, it's good to be back. And I'm sitting here. John comes in and says, Mac, I'm worried about Germany. And I think Germany should be very, very worried when John Davis is worried about you.
It was just that I was reading stuff and even over the last few weeks, but I was reading stuff yesterday. And, there's so much that seems to be going wrong with Germany.
And so much quickly that's been going wrong.
Yeah, exactly. So a few weeks ago, there was the regional elections.
Yeah.
And Thuringia, the county of Thuringia.
Germany's a federal state, so they've got big provinces, and this is one of the big provinces in the east.
So the AfD for the first time won,
and they won more than 30%.
Yes, they did. Yeah. They won well. That, and then in around the same time, Volkswagen were talking about a possible closure of factories, which was completely unheard of.
Yeah.
Then they're struggling with energy, as they have been since Russia invaded Ukraine, and all of the sanctions are kicking in and all that kind of stuff. We've been talking on and off about the wranglings between the Italians and the Germans in the
central bank.
In the central bank, that kind of. Wolfsburg are down at number 13 in the Bundesliga.
Oh, well,
and Harry Kane is the top scorer. An Englishman is the top scorer.
And also a child of Connemara, a son of Connemara.
That is true.
But
so what's going on?
So what we're going to do, as a result of these nightmarish apocalyptic scenarios in John's head, we are going to do two pieces this week on Europe. We're going to start today by talking about Germany, because Germany is the strongest, biggest, most populous country in Europe and has always been the key player, or at least for the last 150 years. So we're going to talk about Germany. And then on Thursday, we're going to talk about, against the background of Mario Draghi's report about Europe basically becoming a fossil, an industrial fossil, what is going on in the greater European economic, political and social picture. So we're all Europe this week, okay?
Good.
But let us start with Germany. I tell you what, John, I have been reading, and it's going to be my touchstone for the next couple of weeks, a German journalist writer called Philipp Blom. Now, you gave me a book, you remember a couple of weeks ago, about the mini ice age.
Oh, yes, yeah.
He's the same writer.
Ah, brilliant. We have to get that fellow on.
This book is called The Vertigo Years, Change and Culture in the West, 1900 to 1914. It's an amazing book. Right, an amazing book about change and culture. So that'll be our touchstone, maybe on the European one tomorrow, and maybe even next week we'll do a little bit more of it.
Yeah.
But for the immediate take on Germany, Beyond the Wall, the book by Katja Hoyer, which we did on the podcast in July, is a gem. Written by probably the best voice on German contemporary history, Katja Hoyer, who lives in the UK but is originally from Berlin. So why don't we go? I think she's in Norway, not in Germany. I think she's in Norway doing a gig.
Beautiful Norway.
Why don't we go to Norway and talk to Katja about what is bugging the Germans? Now we are going to go and talk about Germany. I tell you why. The last couple of months I've been reading German books. This is an amazing book called The German Genius, right? By a guy called Peter Watson, who's an American, an extremely interesting book. I've also been reading, I think I've been told you, this book, I read it again, by Florian Illis, called 1913, The Year Before the Storm. And the last couple of weeks, I've actually read a book by Philipp Blom, German journalist, called The Vertigo Years, Change and Culture in the West, 1900 to 1940. Now, I'm a sucker for all this malarkey, but I think that when you talk about Germany, it is essential to read Germans and talk to Germans to get a sense. And you will remember a couple of months ago, we had the brilliant Katja Hoyer on talking about her book, Beyond the Wall. Katja is on the line, and I want her to explain to me what is going on in Germany. We're going to look at this idea from the perception that Germany has, at least for most of our lifetimes as Irish people, been this solid country in the middle of Europe, stable, keeping the whole show on the road. That's maybe not necessarily the case anymore. We've had extreme right, we've had extreme left, we've Germany in a state of neurosis. What is going on in Germany? Katja, how are you? It's a big question, but how are you first? Good to see you.
I was going to say, how much time have I got? I think in many ways Germany is gripped by the same forces that we see elsewhere. So it's, what we also see in France, in Italy, in the US, in Britain to some extent, in Ireland as well, I think. It's sort of the same issues really that are driving people to the political fringes. As a result of that, you get panic in the center, and that gives an overall feeling of sort of instability that makes everyone nervous, left, right, and center.
Well, listen, Katja, let's go back. Okay, you're a child of the DDR. The podcast we did with you on Beyond the Wall, your book, was fascinating. People absolutely loved it because it gave us a great sense of a living German history, in the sense somebody who was born in the East, now lived in the West. I want to split this into two very brief, if we can, sort of economic historical sections. One is the Germany, Konrad Adenauer, let's say all the way up to, let's say, Helmut Kohl, that 40 years. And then the next 40 years is the years of Mutti, let's say the years of Angela Merkel. So let's say the first 40 years of German, mainly West German, economic history. That was when we were all dependent on them.
Yeah, and I mean, the remarkable thing about that really was that Germany came back from the catastrophe of the Second World War, and it was a economic catastrophe as well as a moral and a political one, and a human one. The way that West Germany bounced back from this in the so-called economic miracle in the 1950s and 60s was really quite remarkable. Living standards went up, and much, much higher than in the powers that defeated it, particularly in Britain. There was a lot of consternation about the fact that, one had gone quite far to defeat the Germans, and there they were kind of prospering and doing well. And I think that's given Germans the confidence that not only their politics, but also their economy is basically indestructible. So no matter how bad it gets, it'll always bounce back. And the fact that we're now in a situation where that certainty is eroding, is deeply disconcerting to people, because they associate German economic weakness with the rise of the Nazi Party in the 1920s and the 1930s. And that's why it always creates a significant amount of angst in Germany when the economy isn't rock solid.
So that's interesting for us, because it's a default position for the rest of the world to say, oh my God, weak Germany, Nazis, right? But you're saying actually also in the German mind, there is this sense that as long as we are rich and we are secure and we have a surplus, we can basically coalesce around the center and we're safe.
Yeah, and the key sort of factor in this used to be unemployment. People used to panic really quite a lot, particularly in the 1980s. After the two oil crises, when unemployment for the first time since the war sort of spiked in Western Germany. And people were worried about it then because they associate the idea of mass unemployment with the Great Depression in the late 1920s and early 1930s, when Germany had 6 million unemployed people, and that helped Hitler into power, not because these unemployed people voted for him. A lot of them stuck with the far left rather than the far right, but because middle class people panicked and then ended up voting for the Nazis because they promised to keep the communists down. And that used to be the thing. Now that we have a much more deregulated economy, unemployment isn't so much the issue, because people don't tend to be unemployed, but they tend to be in precarious sort of employment that isn't exactly sort of safe and stable. And as a result of that, many people feel that their own personal economic situation isn't secure. And that means that they're sort of looking for alternatives, in Germany's case, quite literally, because the far right party calls itself the Alternative for Germany, die Alternative für Deutschland, AfD. And that is directly connected in many ways with economics. People often focus on immigration, but it's just one factor of many that makes people feel the country isn't as safe and stable anymore as it was.
By the way, if you want to keep yourself abreast of all things German, Katja's Substack Zeitgeist is an absolute must read, So Katja, I want to go and talk about now, right? Had we been talking 10 years ago, you and I, Angela Merkel would have been in her second term. She was the queen of Europe. She was the boss of centrism. She was feted by everybody. And Germany was the partner that everybody could depend on. Explain to me the last, 5-10 years, what has happened in Germany, so much so that people are now asking the question, what is happening in Germany? A question we hadn't asked for many, many years.
Well, had we talked 10 years ago, I would have probably said to you then that it's a deceptive sort of stability then, because there were many, many decisions that were either taken or not taken under Angela Merkel, whose sort of immediate consequence wasn't clear at the time. So taking as an example her decision after the nuclear accident in Japan to accelerate Germany's nuclear exit and thereby bank basically almost entirely on Russian oil and gas as a transition fuel, had obviously huge consequences when the invasion of Ukraine happened. And then Germany found out that its dependence on Russian fossil fuel was also a huge economic problem for the country and for the rest of Europe. So it's those sorts of things that, I and others at the time were already quite critical about. But it didn't immediately lead to a sense of crisis because the economy was still stable. We didn't have the sort of conflicts that we've got now internationally that lead to economic problems and many other things that basically weren't apparent at the time. So I would argue that, those issues were already apparent and that what we saw under Angela Merkel was a reassuring kind of stagnation rather than, stability in its actual sense.
I like that. A reassuring stagnation. That's why life feels. It's kind of in the sense of, I'm in the phase now of reassuring stagnation. Let's talk about immigration, because Angela Merkel also, in response to the Syrian civil war, opened up Germany. And I think, was her expression, we can do this? What was the expression?
Yeah, wir schaffen das.
We've got this.
We can do this.
Yeah. And then she was basically saying we can do this. How has that changed Germany? And give me the numbers and the reaction in terms of immigration.
Yeah, so at the time there was a sort of sense of, I would say, almost forced optimism about this. So Angela Merkel had opened the borders. Again, this was a response to a decision she didn't take earlier, because by the time that she made this much wanted decision in 2015, there were already millions of people at Germany's borders, and it was a question of either pushing them back by force, which, of course, for a country like Germany and its history, wouldn't have been a great look, using police force at the borders, and the Bavarian police in particular. So the policing has devolved in Germany, and Bavaria has the border with Austria, where a lot of the sort of flight routes were coming in, basically. And the Bavarian police had already threatened that if there isn't a decision from the federal government, then they'll act and basically use force to push people back. So it was a sort of then, almost snap decision to say, fine, let them in. And then suddenly you had basically just over 1 million people coming into the country completely unchecked, in the sense that people didn't know who was actually coming. There was obviously an assumption that most of them would be Syrians fleeing from the war, but there was really no control over who was in the country and whether they would even register or sort of just go underground. And at the time, Angela Merkel was trying to recognize these issues and saying to people, we can do this, don't worry, we're Germany after all. We've got the economic and moral and political wherewithal to deal with this. And since then, people assumed that was like a one-off, basically, and that Germany could then take the time to integrate these people into the workforce. Maybe, the situation in Syria would stabilize, people would go back, but there was an assumption that it's a one-off thing. And then it did dip a little bit, but then in 2022, there was another huge wave, and Germany now has over 3 million asylum seekers basically in Germany. Whether they're legal or not, they're trying to basically assert whether they have a right to stay. But this means that local communities are massively struggling to cope with this. So people are using like sports halls and town halls, swimming pools, all sorts of public facilities for this that are then obviously not available for their original purpose. Villages have had sort of these container settlements, temporary settlements being put into them. So one village where I spoke to people recently for a journalistic piece, they have more people now, refugees in their village, 500 of them, than the village has got inhabitants. And, it's that sort of thing that's really worrying people. They don't know how to deal with it. And the government so far has taken the stance that, well, there's not much we can do because basically international law and European law prevents us from controlling the German borders. So really, deal with it. And that lack of control, I think, over who's coming into the country, who's going, who's staying, has really created a lot of social and political tension that the government's now trying to deal with. On top of that, we've had a number of terrorist incidents recently, stabbings in particular in public. The most recent and most sort of noted one was in the town of Solingen in Western Germany, where 3 people were stabbed to death and a number of others wounded badly. And there was a huge outcry basically because this person was a Syrian refugee who shouldn't have been in the country because he should have been dealt with by the Bulgarian authorities where he first arrived. And so people started to question this entire system, and there's now massive pressure on the government to do something about it.
Now, in recent months, I've been following you, Katja. You've been obviously doing these fascinating journalistic pieces.
That was you, was it?
yeah, it's under a pseudonym. I'm really weird. So I masquerade as a stalker, pretending to be an economist. But but you've been doing those pieces of going around these villages, particularly in former East Germany, in Mecklenburg and Pomerania, and all these places, these kind of exotic names that people have images of, but they're the former East where you're from, and it's the former East that obviously has reacted first politically and voted in the AfD. And explain to me this place, Thuringia, where the AfD have got into power, have got MPs. What's going on there? What's the history of the place? Why is this? Is this a canary in the coal mine, or is it's just something not to worry about?
Yeah, so to put a bit of geography into this, so Eastern Germany consists of sort of 5 states, of Germany 16. And basically, they each have like local parliaments, basically. It's a bit like the US, and that is quite a federal system with lots of devolved power to the states. And so there was a lot of media coverage now when 3 of these eastern states had regional elections going on. And in Thuringia, which is the most southern of them, this has basically got a border with Bavaria. It's sort of in the center, geographically speaking, of Germany. The AfD actually won the election, and now the other parties are desperately trying to get together some sort of big coalition to keep them out, despite the fact that they won the election. So this is creating a lot of pressure, in terms of you're telling people to do the democratic thing and vote for the centrist parties, and then you do the undemocratic thing from a purely kind of theoretical point of view by keeping the AfD out, which won like over 30% basically of the vote and won the election and is now not in a position to form a government. So that's been a huge thing. The reasons for that, I think, are more to do with sort of economics and social issues than they do necessarily with being kind of from the East. I mean, the big things have been made out of this, where people saying, these people grew up in a dictatorship, they just don't get democracy.
People like you, Katja.
People like me.
Yeah, exactly.
We just don't get it.
Yeah, you had the Kaiser, then you had Hitler, then you had Stalin. What do you expect?
Yeah, that's pretty much the line that both the national and international media have taken on this. Headlines have literally sort of gone, what's wrong with East Germany? And I thought, it's an odd thing to go down that route, because ultimately nobody says the French don't get democracy or the Italians don't get democracy, or the Austrians who started all of this basically in the 1990s with the first far-right movements being quite popular and quite successful there. So and also if you look at the European elections that we had in June, and you look at the social breakdown of the vote, you'll find that the AfD won the working class vote across Germany. And I think that's really behind this. So they won in the European elections about 33% of the vote within the working class demographic across Germany. And East Germans only make up sort of 18% or so of the population. So really, it would have always made much more sense to look at the actual reasons why people go down that route, rather than assuming that there's something wrong with them and just ignoring the problem, really. And I think that's happened for too long. And as a result of that, in the East, where there's a weaker economy, there's more of a working class culture. It's a very rural area as well. So you get more kind of conservative, sort of as in socially conservative attitudes. All of that plays into it. And those are the reasons they're losing entire demographics of people to the center.
And, quite apart from the German football team being appalling in the Euros, which is obviously a massive blow to the German psychology, but how much are things like, VW announcing that they're going to cut jobs in Volkswagen? This is a city that was built around a car. And now what you see is the car is maybe leaving that city. How much of the psychology of your average German is affected by announcements like that?
It's massive. I mean, for Volkswagen, for the first time in its history, to say that it's considering factory closures in its home country, Germany, I think you can't really overestimate the impact of that, because, this is part of Germany's success story. Volkswagen itself was a Hitler project. It's literally the people's car. It didn't take off under Hitler, just like Germany had a catastrophe under him. And then basically you have this immense success story where it reinvents itself, much like West Germany did, as a peaceful, hippie car that under the Volkswagen Beetle becomes this lovable little cuddly thing that everyone likes. And that's kind of really exemplary in the way that West Germany at the time wanted to be seen, kind of as a peaceful, prosperous thing that people associate with stability and with personal wealth. And as a result of that, this has always been whatever is wrong with Germany, so long as Volkswagen keeps going, it can't be that bad. And now that, this is seen as a political failure as well, I should add, so people don't think that this is like an act of God that Volkswagen is suddenly disintegrating, but they associate that with the phasing out of the petrol engine and of the diesel engines that was brought about by a political decision based on the idea that sort of electric vehicles are the way forward, and then forcing a kind of big, ocean liner of a car industry that at the heart of the German economy to adapt to a market that doesn't exist yet by force, and doing it at the breakneck speed, no pun intended, that the politicians have basically placed upon this industry was always going to be challenging, and I think that's why people put the blame squarely again on politics, both within Germany and within the EU, because it's an EU decision, but there was very little resistance coming from German politicians, despite the fact, by the way, that Angela Merkel has always presented herself as the car chancellor, somebody who tried to staunchly stand up for the car industry. And then when it actually came to it and the combustion engine ban was being discussed, she didn't kind of vocally say we can't do that because the German car industry is going to collapse.
So, I mean, this is the very strange thing that has emerged over the last 5 or 6 years, is the environmental movement is seen by the right wing and the left wing as the enemy, as this sort of cosmopolitan, hard to put your finger on movement that is undermining the working man and the working woman. And that's really playing out in Germany politically.
Yeah, it really is. And you can see in the rhetoric also that comes out of the centre-right party, Angela Merkel's former party, that the Greens are the enemy, despite the fact that they are the smaller party compared to the centre-left Social Democrats, the SPD. So, when you see politicians coming out in public and they sort of rant against the opposition or the people in power, they're always focusing on green policies as the sort of vehicle through which to attack, as you just said, sort of the idea of the metropolitan elites, the detached people. I mean, it's not a completely irrational thing in the sense that when you look at who votes for the Green Party, it's wealthy people in the cities. So in that respect, it is indeed kind of the party of the metropolitan elites.
And wealthy people in West Germany as well, in the western part of Germany.
Yeah, absolutely. And also in Berlin, in the capital. So there's that sort of, countryside versus city dynamics that plays into a different social class, as the class struggle, if you want to phrase it in sort of old-fashioned 20th century terminology.
You're the one brought up in East Germany.
Yeah, with the class struggle at the heart of of the government's rhetoric. Yeah, no, so that is indeed a big thing that people, it's sort of placing, the proper people who work with their hands and all of that against the wishy-washy establishment in Berlin and in the cities.
Before you go, Katja, I just want to ask you about the relationship with Russia. When I first went to Germany many, many years ago, I went on a little trip around Stralsund and Rügen and up there in the Baltic part of the former East Germany. And the first thing that always struck me was the proximity geographically of what was then the Soviet Union and then Russia. And then always there's been this very strange relationship I always felt between Germany and Russia. There's an intertwining of these two cultures that is much more profound. We English speakers just see this as the Second World War and the First World War, but there's something much more proximate, the relationship between the Slav and the German, going back hundreds and hundreds of years. And now, of course, the relationship between Germany and Russia is a contested one, and it's a tricky one, and it's emerging in your sort of extreme left, who are sort of Kremlin friendly, but also your business class, which is like, well, let's do a deal with the Russians because the energy stuff, we could get that going again. And Schulz is trying to, be a sort of an intermediary in Ukraine. Explain this complex. I know we haven't got much time, but it is a fascinating thing because the German-Russian relationship is different to any other.
It really is. I mean, you could, depending if we had more time, we could take this back to the 19th century and earlier as well. But there's always been a strand in German politics where people assumed that Germany isn't, in fact, a purely Western country. And that's quite a startling thing for people in France
that
and
a little
Britain
bit.
and Ireland and elsewhere.
Yeah, no, let's tease that out a little bit because I was really made aware of that when I first went to Germany.
Yeah, because it is in the center of Europe and it sees itself as a Central European power. And because when Germany unified as a country in the 19th century, it felt really threatened from the other countries around it. There was it was actually called the fear of encirclement. Bismarck called it this nightmare. The first German Chancellor, Otto von Bismarck. So he literally had sleepless nights over the fact that Germany was surrounded by the great European powers. And so the assumption was that if Germany wanted to exist, even as a country, because it was brand new as a state, it needed to be friends with both the East and the West. And in various incarnations, you see this in Angela Merkel's policy and then basically throughout the entire existence of the German state. Angela Merkel called it Schaukelpolitik, so this idea of swing policy. You kind of balance out the interests of Russia and China, and Germany basically in their relationship with it. With Germany's really important relationship with Western Europe and with the US in particular. And you try not to offend anyone in particular in this very fragile game of East and West. And that's sometimes forgotten. And then on top of that, you've got a kind of, particularly in the East, I think a fear of Russia as well, a really deep-seated fear. So when you speak to people in the East, where it should be quite surprising, I get asked this a lot by Western journalists, kind of why are people in the East particularly sort of anti-Ukraine and pro-Russia? The answer is mostly fear, I think, in the sense that they grew up in a world where you had two superpowers. One was the US, one was the Soviet Union. And the fear of escalation basically was quite justified in the sense that both sides had tactical nuclear weapons stationed in Germany. So if they'd gone at each other's throats, it's, people always talk about the Third World War and kind of nuclear destruction. In the first instance, they would have used those tactical nukes in Germany and the country would have been a wasteland. So there's that fear. And I think because of the collapse of the Soviet Union, because of its moral and economic and political disintegration, the West has lost that deep fear and respect for Russia. Because it lost. I don't think East Germans ever did. I think they still see Russia as this overmighty thing that if you sort of poke the bear, as the metaphor has it too much, then they're going to come back and do once again what they did, particularly to East Germans when they conquered it at the end of the Second World War with sort of mass murder and rapes and all the other atrocities that came with that. So I think that hasn't gone. So when you speak to people in East Germany, and I I've lived in Britain for so long that I wasn't part of this cultural development. So to me, this is as alien as it is to a lot of other people. When I go back there and friends and family tell me about this almighty Russian thing, and you just think, well, that doesn't deny the Ukrainians the principle of self-protection. But they will tell you, people in East Germany, that it doesn't matter how many weapons you give Ukraine, they're always going to lose in the long run, because you can't beat Russia. They'll say things like Napoleon found this out when he went there in 1812. It's that deep-seated in people that believe that you cannot beat Russia. So to them, it makes absolutely no sense in provoking it or helping Ukraine in any shape or form, because the idea is that you just negotiate something with Russia. Ukraine will have to give up some territory and then everyone can live in peace again. That's the sort of logic there, and that's really deep-seated. And you find this within the left in Western Germany as well, although there's often an anti-Western, anti-American stance as well, where the assumption is that it's NATO aggression that's provoked this war, and therefore, Russia has got a point, basically. That's how a lot of Western lefties think about this.
Katja, it is fascinating. We could go on, as you said, we could go way back into the relationship between the Slavs and the Russians and the Prussians, who have been eradicated from history, so much so that we can't even remember them, but they're still there. Katja, listen, I know you're...
One of them is sitting here.
One of them is sitting here talking to me. Exactly. An echt Russian. Listen, Katja, that was wonderful stuff. Thank you so much.
Thank you for having me. It's a pleasure to be back.
Reassuring stagnation, Mac. Is that just another name for old age?
Yes. This is what happens when you wake up and on alighting out of the bed, everything hurts.
Yeah, Hips, that's me every morning. Yeah.
Ankles, shoulders.
Yeah.
That's, I think, reassuring stagnation.
Yeah.
The problem is I'm not too sure about the reassuring bit. The stagnation bit I'm getting, I'm not too sure.
I'm stagnant now.
Yeah. So we're contemplating decline here. We're like the British Empire. How do we manage our decline, John?
Like the Germans, actually, as Katja was saying. And actually, let me just ask you this, because she did mention, it's part of history I'm not hugely up with, but she mentioned Bismarck there being, his paranoia about, when they were united for the first time, and he was paranoid about basically all his neighbors. And I was kind of wondering, number one, was that justified at the time? But to bring it up to now, is that the same kind of paranoia, like from the same paranoia well, as it were, that the East Germans have of Russia?
Yeah, I think so. Years and years ago, I ended up learning German and really liking the country and going and visiting there a lot. And every time I go there, I feel, you learn something really new. In fact, I went to the Goethe Institute here, or the Goethe Institute, as I'd say, to learn German. And the amazing thing is learning German, even after secondary school, wasn't as hard as you imagine. That's the first thing.
Yeah.
It's actually not that difficult a language. To speak badly, it's very, very hard to speak well. But to speak badly,
to get by,
as Cal says to me, who speaks German, my son, he says to me, Dad, you sound like a Tunisian taxi driver in German, right? A Berlin Tunisian taxi driver. So you're able to say, go here, go there, la, la, la. Yeah. But he said it's kind of really embarrassing. Anyway.
He's quite fluid.
He's completely fluent. Yeah. And he went to school there, so he's completely fluent. But there is a deep, deep fracture in the German psyche between the Prussians that we were laughing about at the end with Katja, and what I would call the East Prussians. So these are people who lived in what is called East Prussia, which went all, Mecklenburg, all these places, Kaliningrad now, which was Königsberg, which is the home of Immanuel Kant, all the way into what is now almost Ukraine, bits of Belarus, loads and loads of Poland, right? And they were the Junkers, and they were these basically German Christian knights who went to the East in the 11th, 12th, 13th century. They also extended right down to Saxony, parts of Saxony, and then they had huge Saxon settlements in Romania, in Serbia, and of course, Catherine the Great then imported a whole load of Germans, and they're now called the Volga Germans. So there's a whole... And a lot of those guys ended up in Argentina, the Volga Germans. The Gabriele Heinze, the Man United fullback from many years ago was one of them, right? A Volga German. So they emigrated from Volga to Argentina. But anyway, so all around what we don't know as kind of Western Europeans, all around what we know now to be Eastern and Central Europe, there were German colonies of Germans, which is why Hitler appealed to pan-Germanism, which is wherever German was spoken was Germany.
Okay.
Right? So that was part of his many different sort of ideas. Quirks that became very, very dangerous.
Yes.
And then, of course, as opposed to the Prussians, there was the Catholic descended from the Romans, Western Germany, all along the Rhine, which has always been more liberal, more tolerant, all that sort of stuff, right? And there's been this fracture at the heart of being a German for many, many centuries. But the notion that Bismarck and subsequently Hitler felt, and all German leaders, of being surrounded by enemies is real. So if you look at the great British-French alliance was Britain, France, and Russia.
Yeah.
Now, Britain, France, and Russia are not natural bedfellows. Can you imagine Britain was the most, apart from what they were doing here in Ireland, they would tell themselves the most progressive country in the world in terms of liberalism, etc.
Yeah.
Them being in an alliance with Russia, which was in 1914.
But
still
that
had
was a
serfs.
reaction, though.
No, but the idea was it was my enemy's enemy.
Yeah.
So the Brits and the French, who were very, very enlightened countries at the time, okay, very sophisticated, forward-looking, were in an alliance with Russia was only because of Germany.
Yeah.
So it's to surround Germany. And of course, Germany came into existence because the Prussians hated the Austrians, even though they both spoke German, because the Prussians were Protestants, the Austrians were Catholics. So it's the Habsburgs against the Hohenzollerns and all that sort of stuff.
Yeah.
So again, they found that the Austrians were their enemy and they went to war against the Austrians. The French were the enemy, they went to war against the French, and they always felt threatened. So this idea that we see Germany as the aggressor, and that is the shorthand in the English language, that Germany has always been the aggressor. Germans see themselves as the victim.
Yeah.
They are surrounded by enemies. They don't like the Slavs don't like them. The Austrians were always kind of wishy-washy Germans who'd stab them in the back if they got half the chance. The French hated them, the Brits hated them, and of course, the big Mac Daddy on the block, the Russians hated them. So yeah, it's very deep, and it's something that we don't appreciate.
Yeah.
That they feel that they are put upon, whereas we feel they are the ones who do the putting upon.
Yes, yeah.
And
You kind of wonder, like, what came first, chicken and egg?
They feel that their wars have always been wars of defense.
Yeah.
And even if they kicked out first to defend themselves. Now, of course, that doesn't stand up to much rigorous analysis in the Second World War. But I think in the First World War, the German position is very understandable.
Yeah. So based on what Katja was saying and the rise of the right in the East in particular, is Germany, well, first of all, did Angela Merkel make a terrible, terrible mistake in opening the borders, first of all? And as a result of that, we have the AfD.
Yeah.
But is Germany or Germany as a whole going to be shifting more to a Hungarian stance?
Well, I would maybe not completely Hungarian, but first of all, you see, the AfD was started. This is what you should be very worried about. All listeners should be worried about this. Any political party started by economists is a bad idea, right? Because the AfD was started...
Anything started by economists.
The AfD was started by economists. It's by people who actually were out to defend the Bundesbank, of all things. The bizarre birth that has now been, or let's say a bizarre fertilization process that has now been delivered as quite an ugly child. That's the first thing. Second thing, I think, is you cannot divorce the fact that what is really affecting Germany is the sense that their economy is out of touch. So what has always, or at least since the Second World War, as Katja was saying, been the reassuring default position for Germans is we have an indestructible economy based, I think I've told you before, based on basically carbon, right?
Yes.
So they have imported,
yeah.
Basically the Germans import energy and export energy.
Yeah.
And they import carbon and they turn them into cars, in effect, a big, heavy industry. What you notice about Germany is that very, very, very few new German companies. So all the old German companies that we know, the really dominant ones, were built and constructed in the late 19th century. So they're over 100, 150 years old.
There's not a startup.
There's no startup culture.
Yeah.
There's very, very little VC money. There is no German Google. There is no German WhatsApp, all those sort of ones. Even the Russians have Telegram and their own sort of things, right? The Germans don't have any of that. So there is a sense that the Germans, again, then doubled down on the car industry in the 1990s and 2000s. And as long as the Chinese were importing German technology, that was fine. But the Chinese have done what they always do, which is basically they take the technology, they cut and paste it, and they use themselves. So German roads are now full of, or increasingly, home to Chinese cars.
Yes.
What she was talking about, the environmental movement, doubling down on electric vehicles when Europeans don't seem to want them. Electric car registrations are falling.
Yeah.
And of course, the Germans feel they've paid for this, that in a way they've been sort of hoodwinked by the environmental movement. And now it's their car industry is getting hosed. I think the really big warning for Germany is Britain. That in the 1970s and 1980s, Britain abandoned its heavy industries very, very quickly and didn't replace it with anything.
Yeah.
And I think Germany's is about to go through the same sort of cycle.
Yeah.
And that, I think, is the worry.
Well, what are they going to replace it with?
I'm not so sure.
Are there any ideas?
I'm not so sure. I'm not so sure.
Yeah.
I'm not so sure. It's certainly interestingly, France has a much more high-tech technology hub in and around Paris. And French tech is regarded as amongst the best in the world.
Yeah.
Germany doesn't seem to have that. So you have 90 million people in the center of Europe, surrounded by countries that they feel they're paying the wages of, right?
Yeah.
Because Germany has always financed the European Union. They have Russia as an enemy now, cutting off supplies. Many East Germans are ambivalent about Ukraine. In the West, the Americans are telling them they've got to pay for their defense for the first time ever. That's part of Trump's entire thing.
Yeah.
And of course, China is eating their lunch.
Yeah.
So the Germans feel very isolated, very, very vulnerable. And for the first time in 50 years, I think they feel not invincible, but very fragile. And that, as we'll find out on Thursday, is very worrying for Europe. So we'll leave it there.